April 4th, 1814. The Château de Fontainebleau is freezing. You can almost feel the damp chill of the lingering French spring radiating off the stone walls of the emperor's private study. 4 men are standing in front of the desk. Michel Ney, Jacques MacDonald, Armand de Caulaincourt, and Claude Victor Perrin. These are the marshals of the empire. Over the last 20 years, they've ridden across the plains of Europe, slept in the mud, and commanded the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of men to build this empire. Today they reek of wet wool and horse sweat, and they have come to tell their boss that they are done. Napoleon Bonaparte sits behind his mahogany desk. He is 44, his skin pale in the low firelight. He holds a quill over a draft of his own conditional abdication. For 2 decades, the stroke of that pen moved artillery corps and erased entire national borders. Now it's being used to negotiate his personal survival. He looks up at them. He insists the army will obey him. He will march on Paris, he says. Marshal Ney, a man Napoleon once called the bravest of the brave, just shakes his head. The army, Ney replies quietly, will obey its generals. It's an incredible scene, mostly because of how bureaucratic it actually is. This isn't Caesar, say, getting stabbed on the Senate floor. It's a mutiny by spreadsheet. The marshals have looked at the grain reserves. They know the Russian and Prussian cavalry are holding the roads. The arsenals in Paris belong to the coalition. The math of the war dictates surrender, and these men are simply refusing to pretend otherwise. Napoleon stares at them. Then he dips his quill into the glass inkwell, the metal nib scratching loudly in the quiet room, and signs away the continent. I always find it fascinating that the greatest military empire of the 19th century didn't end on a battlefield. It ended in a drafty room, forced by the sheer exhaustion of the men holding the ledgers. To really understand why the empire collapsed this way, you have to look at how it was built. People tend to forget that before he was a dictator, Napoleon was a math nerd with a cannon. He was an artilleryman. To an artillery officer, a battlefield is just a grid. Victory isn't about honor or glory. It's about moving a specific weight of iron to a specific coordinate before the other guy does. It requires cold calculation. When Napoleon seized power in the clumsy, bloody coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, France was a mess. The government was bankrupt, the currency was worthless paper, and people were rioting for bread. Napoleon didn't see a political crisis, he saw a logistical failure. A state that can't feed its citizens or pay its soldiers is a state that collapses. So he applied the discipline of an artillery battery to the French government. He centralized everything. He instituted the prefect system. Governors appointed directly by Paris who acted as his eyes and hands in the provinces. Suddenly his desk was flooded with data. He knew the price of wheat in Lyon. He knew the exact number of cavalry mounts available in Burgundy. He understood a fundamental truth about autocracy. You cannot rule what you cannot measure. The efficiency was brutal, but it worked. He stabilized the currency and standardized the laws. In return, the French people gave him bodies. The military needed about 80,000 fresh men every year. The bureaucracy extracted them. Every French male had to register at 18. Villages held public lotteries where teenage boys reached into wooden boxes to pull out slips of paper that would decide if they lived or died. The poor marched off in cheap, itchy blue wool. The wealthy paid poor laborers to take their place. The prefects recorded the departures in black ink. Months later they recorded the battlefield deaths in red. All of this data flowed back to one man. Napoleon slept maybe 4 hours a night. He operated out of a green-walled study, dictating letters while pacing, while soaking in the bath, while eating. He micromanaged a continent. He'd authorized the deployment of an entire army corps, and in the next breath, order a specific bridge repaired in a tiny German village. But control requires a nervous system, and Napoleon's was run by a man named Joseph Fouché. Fouché was a former priest who understood human paranoia better than anyone alive. As the head of the Ministry of General Police, he built an analog surveillance state that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. He had informants everywhere, sweeping tavern floors, driving carriages, listening. A drunken complaint over cheap wine was written down, categorized, and filed in the ministry's massive leather ledgers. The police maintained alphabetical files on everyone. If your file got too thick, the gendarmerie showed up at your door before dawn. Then there was the cabinet noir, the black chamber inside the post office. Clerks used hot steam to melt the wax seals on private letters. They'd transcribe the contents, forge the wax stamps, and send the letters on their way. Napoleon read these transcripts every morning. He knew which of his generals were in debt and which of his ministers were having affairs. He monetized their secrets. He also controlled reality. When he took power, Paris had 73 political newspapers. Napoleon reduced them to 4, appointed the editors himself, and made sure censors reviewed every galley. He banned political debate entirely. The state-run Bulletin de la Grande Armée told the public what was happening in the wars. It fabricated casualties and spun disastrous retreats as tactical masterstrokes. For 10 years, the system worked flawlessly. Napoleon treated Europe like a giant math problem, using his superior supply chains to move massive armies faster than anyone thought possible. He smashed the Austrians and the Prussians, but the system demanded total compliance. And humans don't comply when they are starving. Unable to invade Britain, Napoleon tried to break them economically with the Continental System, an embargo that banned British trade across Europe. It was a disaster. It required legions of customs officers to patrol every dock and warehouse from Antwerp to Hamburg, burning confiscated cotton and sugar in the public squares while the local economies tanked. When Tsar Alexander I of Russia finally had enough in 1810 and quietly opened his ports to save his country from bankruptcy, Napoleon saw it as a systemic threat. His entire system relied on total submission. He couldn't let it slide. He decided to punish Russia. He built the army of 20 nations. In the spring of 1812, 600,000 men gathered across Germany and Poland. The logistics were mind-boggling. They requisitioned 200,000 horses and built massive supply wagons to carry thousands of tons of flour and lead. Napoleon planned for a rapid 3-week campaign. But the math broke the moment they crossed the Niemen River in June. It's hard to wrap your head around the horrors of the Russian campaign. We always talk about the cold, but the army was actually destroyed by the summer. Heavy rains turned the dirt roads to deep clay mud. The massive wagons sank. The horses blew out their lungs trying to pull them and died in the thousands. The Russians refused to give him a decisive battle. They just retreated, burning their own farms and poisoning their own wells as they went. By July, the French supply lines had completely collapsed. The soldiers were eating unripe rye. Dysentery tore through the ranks. Men were abandoning their muskets in the mud because they were simply too weak to carry them. Hundreds of thousands of men died of disease or deserted before they even saw a snowflake. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September, the city was empty. Then the Russians set it on fire. He sat in the Kremlin waiting for a surrender that never came. The retreat was an absolute disintegration of human life. The temperature hit 30 below zero. Men literally froze to the iron wheels of their artillery pieces. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée stumbled back out of Russia, 500,000 men were dead or gone. Napoleon panicked. He abandoned his freezing troops and rode a fast sleigh back to Paris. He needed to spin the narrative. He was too late. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, his former foreign minister, was already hosting quiet dinners in Paris. Talleyrand was the ultimate survivor, a man who had navigated the revolution, the terror, and the empire. He looked at the ledgers. He saw the empty treasury and the missing army. He calculated that Napoleon's odds of survival were 0, and he quietly began sending letters to the Russian Tsar and the Austrian ambassador. The blood was in the water. Britain poured gold into Prussia and Russia. The Sixth Coalition formed. Napoleon demanded another army. The Ministry of War dragged teenagers from the farms. The class of 1814, then the class of 1815. These kids were malnourished, marching in wooden shoes without winter coats. France was physically empty. There were no more horses. There was no more iron. In October 1813, 500,000 men collided in the rain and smoke at Leipzig. The French fought until their ammunition was gone. A panicked corporal blew a bridge too early during the retreat, drowning thousands of his own men. The coalition pushed into France. By March 30, 1814, Russian and Prussian artillery were firing on the heights of Montmartre. Paris was under siege. Napoleon was 80 miles away, frantically trying to command the defense via mounted couriers. But Cossacks kept intercepting his riders. Inside the city, the municipal grain reserves were empty. The infantry was out of bullets. Marshal Marmont looked at the situation, got a quiet message from Talleyrand, and decided to surrender the capital to save it from burning. The capitulation was a dry administrative document. But the moment the ink dried on March 31, Napoleon was disconnected from his empire. Talleyrand immediately convened the Senate, managed the clerks, and drafted the legal decree deposing the emperor for illegal taxation and unconstitutional conscription. Which brings us back to that freezing room in Fontainebleau on April 4. Napoleon was completely isolated. He had been trying to draft orders for a final assault on Paris, but the quartermasters had nothing left to give him. The math was finally impossible. When Ney and the marshals walked in and refused to relay his orders, the transmission lines of his authority were severed. A dictator without an army to enforce his will is just a man shouting alone in a room. He signed the abdication. A few days later, the Bourbons took back the government. It's almost funny how quickly the bureaucracy pivoted. The same police informants kept working their routes, just reporting to the king instead. Clerks in the Ministry of the Interior took sharp pumice stones and literally scraped the imperial eagle off the state letterheads, replacing Emperor with General Bonaparte. In the courtyard of the police ministry, Fouché ordered his men to burn the dossiers detailing the bribes paid to the marshals, the exact same men who had forced Napoleon to surrender. The fire burned hot, consuming the evidence of their complicity, leaving nothing but gray ash on the cobblestones. And out in front of the Tuileries Palace, a royalist blacksmith stood with a heavy steel file, quietly grinding the gilded ends off the iron gates, letting the metal filings fall into the dirt as if the last 20 years had never happened.